welcome everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Christine Vaccarino, and I am a huge fan of Helen Lundström Erwin and her new book, The Lure of Water and Wood. And so thank you, Helen, for being our amazing author and guest today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
You have written this amazing novel, gorgeous book, and everything about it is just amazing. The Lure of Water and Wood, about two mythical creatures who people believed in the time were actually real from the 17th, 18th centuries. The amazing magical part of this is that Helen was able to research the actual court cases that took place, where people were tried for where people were suspicious of being associated with these two mythical creatures. Helen has written this story from their perspective, and so we can understand how they felt during these times and these trying times. But with your artful and deeper creation of these characters, we also get this idea and this picture of this evolving time period, which showcases the changing world around them and gives us a really unique view into the time period. And you just have created an epic story that's grounded in the research and that alluring fantasy. That aspect that's written from their perspective is just so engaging. And just for any of you who don't know, the Helen's story is an epic story of Sweden's social evolution from pre-Christian time. So that's where our brains sort of see this picture moving over the course of history. And the plot follows this social history and the early beliefs and superstitions that they couldn't explain. And all of that time during their love and drama and the conflict that ensued as a result of all of this change, the history lends itself beautifully to this fantasy storytelling. So Helen, with your characters sitting on your shoulders, might you please introduce your two wonderful people that are in your heart, but also on your shoulders at this very given moment?
Sure. So here we have Näcken, and he is a water creature. As you see here, he sits in the river with his violin. He's a very talented musician, and he's a very sensitive, loving, caring man. But he also has a nasty habit of drowning people in the river. Oh. And he doesn't like that about himself, but he can't help it. He can't stop. And then here we have Rå, who is a forest creature. And she is a very confident, very old woman. She's been around a lot longer than Näcken has. And she's very womanly, but she's a mythological creature, a forest sprite, if you will. And she has very long hair, and under her hair, she has a hole in her back. And when she moves her hair aside, she lures men into the woods with her to have sex with them.
Amazing. So when you're reading the book, as an English learner, and not knowing Swedish, I would ask if everyone would have a chance to practice saying their names as spoken in Sweden as Swedish. So would you maybe take us through that, and maybe everyone can unmute and we can all just practice saying each character's name after you tell us how to pronounce it?
Sure. So we start with Rå.
Oh. Rå.
Rå.
Rå. Rå.
Yeah. Very good.
Sounding like we're getting it.
Yes, you do. So think of it like this. It's like raw, almost like a raw egg, but not really. And then it's a little shorter, or almost like you're saying, oh, no. No.
No.
Yay.
Almost like you're swallowing it a little bit.
Yeah, almost like you're swallowing it. And then here we have Näcken. Okay, almost like you say, nah, Näcken. Näcken.
Näcken.
Yeah, more like Näcken.
Näcken.
Yay, you got it.
Well, thank you for participating and for the practice, because I definitely need it as I'm reading, as I've read it. I am reminded on how to pronounce it now, so that actually even brings me closer to them.
Oh, thank you.
Well, Helen, we have some questions for you. And just as a reminder, I'm going to be asking some questions, but if you think of some, you can put them in the chat, and at the very end, we'll have a Q&A. All right, so hopefully we'll answer most of them, but if there's anything else, you can mention it later. So Helen, growing up in Sweden clearly plays a role in the setting and the history that's encompassed in your work. What is your specific inspiration for this book? Like, what parts of the book come from your childhood and your experiences growing up in Swedish culture? And is there any trace of Rå and Näcken today in Swedish culture? Why do you think you even conceived of this story?
Well, it's manifold, I should say. But first, I read an article about court cases involving both Näcken and Rå that took place in the 1600s and early 1700s. And I was blown away because I never heard of this. I had no idea that these creatures that I had heard of as a child, being more like storytelling, fairy tales, part of Sweden's art and our stories. I had no idea that a little bit earlier in Swedish history, they were considered real beings, and the people who spent time with them, they were sentenced. They were taken to court. And this article described that, and I was blown away again, like I said, and I started to research it. And there's a lot of history. So that's one reason I was so intrigued and decided to write about this. The other one is that both my dad and my grandfather always told these stories and these fairy tales to me when I was a child about being in the forest, and it was very mystical, and the forest was always beautiful and green and lush, and the waters and in the rivers, and it was very, very, very rich and beautiful, and I adored it. And then the other part of your question was if there's traces of it today. And yes, in our art, there's a lot of art where they're mentioned, and in our folk tales and stories. And sometimes people joke a little bit about Näcken and say, oh yeah, that man is so handsome. He's like Näcken himself. Oh my God. Or there's a guy who plays violin really beautifully. Somebody might say, oh my God, he has Näcken power.
Wow.
But it's very tongue in cheek.
Yeah. So I love your use of lure and lore, because the folklore is clearly alive and well, but then, as you discovered, was a major part of the cultural growth and change over time. What percentages of lore, your book, are from Swedish lore and life of Sweden during the book's time period? And then what part of it is more fictional characterization from your own creative genius?
Well, there are several court cases in this book, and all those court cases are based on actual court cases that have been documented. And I have read those documents, and I have all the questions that are asked in the book during those cases, during the trials. They were questions that were asked. So it's very much based on those court cases. But then it's also based on the settings in Sweden at that time. It was very different from what we're used to. There's a lot of, they didn't have, obviously no electricity, or very rural farming communities, very religious. So there's a lot of that history in the telling of my book. But then my creative side, writing from Näcken and Rå's perspectives, made me able to elaborate quite a lot. And that's where my creative juices really took off, because, they're myth, but it's their story, they're telling it. So that was a lot from my creative process, to be able to be inside of their heads.
Yeah, your characters are very complicated. We can make connections to our own selves. Obviously, these are mythological creatures, but we can absolutely relate to them. I mean, speaking as an I say we, but since they're complicated, and then also thinking about how to pull the story along as it happened in Sweden or any European time. What did it feel like to write Näcken as a character who kills, who is actually a murderer?
It was very challenging because here we go again. I'm very attached to him. And he is very sensitive. He's a musician. He's very creative. He's very loving and that's my interpretation of him. But he does kill. So I did sometimes have to remind myself when I wrote the stories about him and what happened in the story that, Helen, he is not a nice man. He kills people. And there was one point specifically when I thought, can I really make him do this? And I had to tell myself, yes, you can, because he's Näcken. This is who he is. He kills. And I really worked my writing muscles there and it was fun. I enjoyed it. It's fun to write that. As a writer, it's stuff to work with. So
Yeah,
I
really.
enjoyed it, but it was challenging.
Yeah, you had to dig really deep for that. And I think that Näcken himself is, complex, but also the guilt, as you mentioned, that he feels because of this power that he has that he can't control. He's aware, he knows he has choices, and then he still goes to the dark side, even though he really is a good person. He knows he is, and you see it in your characterization, but then he slips away. And that really is something we can all relate to, especially just thinking about modern life. It's not like things have changed that much there. How much of your characters' personalities come from you yourself? For example, like Rå is flirtatious and connected to nature, and Näcken has he's naive, but he's also impulsive, but he's also very genuinely caring. Where are you in all of this?
Well, first, I can't flirt, even if my life depended on it. So I just can't. I just start laughing. So, but I'm married. I have a husband over there in my room, so it worked out anyway. Where I'm similar to Rå is that I'm very confident. And I feel Rå in my story is also very confident. And I have a real love for nature. Nature is almost religious to me. So in that way, I'm very similar to her, and I think that comes from me. When it comes to Näcken, I am very sensitive. I cry easily, and I analyze things a lot. So I don't know if I would call myself naive and impulsive. Maybe a little impulsive, sure, but yeah.
But I think the creativity of your characters, I mean, as you mentioned, Rå she's very grounded and she's very sure of herself. At the same time, she's also very protective. She protects her beliefs, but she also protects this beautiful natural world around them. And I think I love that about the way you've created their story. It must have been fun spending hours in the libraries, I should say, and with Swedish institutions and organizations, researching them, delving deeply. But before this interview, you have mentioned to me that you're a bit of a history geek. How did you keep that history nerd in check? How did you strike the balance?
To answer the first part first, it was amazing to spend time in libraries and study and research all these things there's so much. There's a lot of documentation in the Swedish Historical Society and other places that has a lot of information for me. And I spoke to a lot of experts on this, and I love that. I love asking questions and figuring out how to bring the history into my story. And I loved going to the library and sit there. It was interesting because you can borrow history books from Sweden on interlibrary loan. So I spent a lot of time at the main library in New York City, a gorgeous old building. And some of the books I was not allowed to take home. So I had to sit there and take notes, and I love that. And sorry, can you remind me of the second part of it?
The other part was, striking the balance, that history, and I'm actually so excited. I want to go sit in the library and read history. But as far as how did you strike the balance between you're fictionalizing your characters and getting your creative part too, to get these characters to come alive for us with a mythological, balance between that and the history?
Yeah, I was, I could have made the book a lot longer. I could have added a lot more historical details to it. But I have to stay true to the story and the flow of the story and all of that. So I had to decide which parts were the most important and what carried the story, excuse me, forward. But let me see.
Yeah.
Remind me again.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
yeah, when you think about Raw as a character, I mean, as far as how the balance being, how much do I get into her as a person and then
Yeah.
also keep the story moving along? So maybe just a little bit more about the excitement of creating her and in mixing in that history, but also
Yeah.
getting your creative juices in there.
Thank you. Yeah, that was great actually, because there are some of the court cases that are, very involved, and there's a couple where both Näcken and Rå are involved. And so one way I struck the balance was to make the exact proceedings in the courthouse, a little more creative, so it would, so the story would flow a little better, so
Yeah.
that the reader would be with the characters and not exactly how court proceedings in 1655 was at that time. So I, focus more on the emotions of the story and the questions and how my characters felt when this took place. So
Yeah.
I think that's a balance where I was a little more character focused other than history focused.
Yeah.
Other times I really spent time on history and showed how how times changed in Sweden, how, because the book begins in 1599 and it ends in 1749. So there were a lot of things happened, excuse me, at that time, and there was a lot of change. So
Yeah.
that was very interesting to do.
And as far as developing Raw's character, the idea of how to deepen her and help make her relatable. And as a woman who is not only
Yeah.
very confident, which was not a characteristic of women in the past because they weren't given a lot of leeway to be their own person, she is, she's an epic story, but she's also timeless. I mean,
Yeah.
can you speak about her age and living through centuries? I mean,
Sure.
those perspectives were also reflected in the book.
Thank you. Yes, exactly. So she has been around a long time, since before Christianity came to Sweden. So she had seen views on women and sexuality change back and forth through her lifetime. And so I felt I had leeway because of that to take her out of time a little bit and make her more of in one way, like a woman, like we are today. We feel more confident usually about things that were more taboo in earlier times. And she wasn't human. So that was also a way I could be more creative. And she lived in that time, but she was still somebody else with a wider perspective. So I felt I could create her as more of a confident woman who felt good about herself and what she wanted, and she was very, very confident with her own sexuality and knew what she wanted and knew what she wanted to do and how she felt. And that was fun to write.
Yeah. It also allows us to really see the difference and strike the contrast between women at the time and her. You know what I mean? So it really helps us to also to develop a better understanding of the time period as well.
Yeah.
This is an interesting thought. In the forward, you mentioned that the people of the time period believed in mystical characters to be real and that just walked among them. Can you comment on that?
Sure. So we think of it as a belief, but it wasn't a belief. It was a fact of life. Just like it's raining or there's a sea or there's a house across the street, that's the way it is. It's right there. There's a house and it's raining today. Nobody would ask, do you believe in rain? Like, what do you mean? It rains. And it was the same. They knew that they existed. They were part of nature, part of the natural world.
Now, another thought comes to mind about mythical creatures. Of all the mythical creatures that must have existed during that time period, why did you choose these two?
Well, they're so much part of the Swedish culture. It is with us somehow in arts and folklore and storytelling and modern renditions of older times, they're usually around. They're just kind of in our consciousness. And also because of my dad's and grandfather's stories and those articles I read, that's really why I picked them. And they're very I have a feeling for these two characters that I assume is from my childhood and also from maybe living abroad and feeling more connected to my Swedish history, perhaps.
Mm.
Yeah.
How did thoughts change about them over time? I mean, how did they also, I mean, what was believed? What were, in your research, what have you
Mhm.
found out were the beliefs about them? And I'm sure that changed over time, but what were some of the thoughts about them of the time period?
Yeah, that was very interesting to research and also to write because the scientists were discussing this. All the scholars and scientists were talking about them, and it was a serious subject that people sat and discussed. And it fluctuated and changed a little, but there were debates if they were perhaps made of vapor
Mm.
or if they were a hybrid between a human and an animal. And they all agreed, though, that they were natural and that God allowed the devil to use um, fog or vapor or animals and yeah, and humans to create this. So it was natural because everyone believed in God, and if they existed, God had allowed it. And it was very interesting to read how it changed. And then it seemed like in earlier times, people thought it's vapor, probably fog, and the devil takes the fog and he creates, creatures out of them. And Näcken, he was aware of these beliefs, and he was very bothered by them. He did not like it. And Rå, she didn't care. She thought humans were a little silly.
So with that strong connection to like that, and the way that you actually allow us to see that they are understanding how people believe and keeping that in their own heads and saying, what the heck? But centuries have passed. And so what are some modern myths that still exist about them today? You had mentioned something a little bit earlier today in our conversation, but what can you review and maybe elaborate a little bit on how people and where do they exist in media and today? Where would they be seen?
Well, they would be seen in stories and in art. Um, and people sometimes joke around if there's a musician that's very talented. People might say, "Oh, wow, he has he has some Näcken in him. He's so good." And also, if a man is really, really sexy, somebody might say, "Oh my gosh, there's like Näcken there. You can't resist him." And Reo, I think, is more mystical, more like a nature spirit, and more that like creative, natural, womanly self that sometimes I feel we're all a little drawn, especially to women, to that character, somebody that's at home in nature and feels very at home in the woods, in the forest, and can speak with animals. And there's just this nature need in us. So I
Mm.
think we see that a lot. We see her always depicted as a lover of nature and somebody who may do rituals in nature. And we don't see as often as, I should mention this, that in earlier times, she was sometimes depicted as somebody with a tail or horse hooves or horse eyes or even a cow rump or a horse rump. We don't see that much now.
So the evolution of the characters is still ongoing. It's
Yeah.
very timely. I mean, as ancient as these stories are and as grounded as they have been, they're still pervasive, which is really lovely. I mean, that it does, like we talk about culture and what anchors you are some of our storytelling. That's where we can't lose track of those or lose touch of them without losing a part of ourselves and our understanding of what makes us, connected to our histories.
That's true.
So how do you come up with human personalities then for mythological creatures? Like how did you do that?
Well, in the history records of them, they're often told as being among the people. And especially Näcken, who is a musician, he was sometimes, they said that he came and played at weddings and he played at other functions. So he was a water creature, but he was also like a fleshy person who walked around. And so it wasn't that hard. I just uh, created them as people, and they just had these secrets that they hid about themselves. And Rå, she calls herself Magda in my book. When she's out with people, she hides her back hole under scarves and dresses, and she wears maybe an extra shawl over it and covers it, and then she hides that part of herself. But yeah, it's like people. We live, and there are some parts of our lives we don't tell each other, and we keep to ourselves, and we live our life as our professional selves, and that's what we present. But inside of us, when we're at home, we may not even acknowledge it to ourselves. But there's something there we're not talking about
Yeah.
that may be hard even for us to acknowledge. So I drew on that a lot.
Yeah, that is absolutely clear. And it allows us all to dig deeper. And I think that it also made me think about the fear and the excitement of knowing that there are these characters, these creatures walking among us. There was a push and pull effect on the people, the regular everyday people, because they didn't have any. They were intrigued that this existed, and it seemed so exciting, and that power was. They feared at the same time. So there was a fear, but also an excitement. And then how the mythological creatures chose to reveal themselves in different ways in different times, and accidentally or on purpose. Your characters are mythological, but they are also very religious. Why?
Well, they lived in their time. And to me, as a writer, especially of historical fiction, like all my books are historical fiction, and this one is also historical fantasy. It's important for me that I write about people who are people of their time. They lived at that time, and everyone was religious. You didn't question God. God was as natural as the rain or the sea. It was just the way it was. And what's interesting with both my characters, and perhaps especially Rå, she was very old, so she believed in the old religion, and she was very devoted to Freya and Thor, and she felt that the new religion was kind of annoying. She didn't like it very much. And Näcken, he grew up Catholic, and then Sweden's church changed and became Lutheran, and he didn't like that. And he was not only hiding his murderous self, he also hid that he was secretly Catholic still. And so that was very interesting to explore. And both Näcken and Rå had thoughts about each other and their religions. Näcken thought Rå's beliefs were silly, and Rå thought that Näcken's beliefs were silly. So it was fun to explore. But yeah, I did it because that's the time period. It was normal. It was what people did at that time. People were always religious.
Yeah, and it took a really long time. It was very clever to have them be immortal, and then living through these entire chunks of time. And it takes such a long time for change to occur. And then they're taking it all in, but they're still grounded in what their original belief systems were. And then being able to like adjust and change and adapt and figure out how to fit in and not, look their ages. And that, they're really, we're under a lot of pressure. And it was actually very clear in your writing that was a struggle for them, and understanding their struggles helps us feel the time change.
Yeah, thank you.
How do you get past a block in storyline? Like what inspires you in a way that moves you forward and gets the story moving again from a writing perspective?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's always history. I don't often get writer's block. History always pulls me into the story again. And I just need to research a little more, and there's some more details that I find interesting, and I explore that, and that inspires me. So writing is, yeah, it comes pretty easy, but it's all thanks to history, and that really inspires me.
You've talked about your biggest writer's challenge with Näcken, but what was your biggest challenge with Rå? And what did you discover about your foremothers that you may not have known before when researching both your characters and Swedish history and culture?
Ah, well, the Rå's sexuality was a little challenging because not that I'm not confident in my own, but it was new to me to write about a woman who is so forthcoming, or a creature, I should say, who's so forthcoming and not shy about it. So that stretched my muscles a little bit. And but it was very interesting to do that because it also felt empowering in a way. Because my other work, I've written about women who where sex was an issue for women, and so it was interesting to explore that. And I think what she taught me also is that women come from very strong stock. We have foremothers behind us, and we go far back in time. Women were really, really strong, and they worked with nature. They took care of their families, and in the Norse times where Reo grew up, women had a very strong role, and I felt that confidence. It's something that I was taught about my foremothers, that it's there too. It's not only the struggles, and we have that power and that strength.
Yeah, we stand on their shoulders.
Yes, we do.
So this concludes our launching of your new greatest work, The Lore of Water and Wood. Helen, congratulations on this most amazing book, and enjoy your read, everyone.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. We'll look forward to the next time.
Thank you. Me too.